This episode of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please sign up to give us $1 or $2 per episode over at patreon.com/geeks. And I want to give a special thank you to Clement Coleman, Garrett Lester, and Anders Kilstedt, who all just signed up this week to support us on Patreon. Special thanks as well to Ask Your Friends, who just gave us 5 stars on iTunes, writing, "This podcast has inspired me to finish a lot of my science fiction writing, and has also introduced me to amazing authors via a fantastic interviewer. It's also inspired me to apply to Clarion West this year. Thank you." So big thanks again to Ask Your Friends for that great review, and I hope you get accepted to the workshop. Alright, so now let's get to our panel.
Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here is your host, David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 376 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Today on the show we'll be discussing seasons 1 and 2 of the Netflix original series The OA. And this will include spoilers for every episode of the show, so just be aware of that. And I'm joined by 3 guests. So first up, we've got Anthony Ha, making his 14th appearance on the show. He covers media, advertising, and pop culture for the news site TechCrunch, where he also hosts the podcast Original Content. A chapbook of his short stories called Love Songs for Monsters was published by Youth in Decline in 2014, and his short story Late Train appears in the February issue of Lady Churchill's Rosebud Wristlet. So Anthony, welcome to the show.
Hello, thanks for having me back.
Then next up, we've got Sara Lynn Michener, also making her 14th appearance on the show. She's a Ravenclaw Trekkie maker feminist who writes at Medium and lives in New York City with a Renaissance engineer, a dog, and a bird. So Sarah, welcome to the show.
Happy to be here.
And also joining us today is Rafael Jordan, making his 9th appearance on the show. He's written over 25 feature films that have premiered on video and cable television, including The Immortal Voyage of Captain Drake, Star Runners, and Vampire Nation. He also co-wrote the new series Salvage Marines, starring Casper Van Dien and Peter Shinkoda. So Rafael, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me back.
Okay, and so how this panel came about is a few weeks ago we did a panel on pretentious science fiction movies, and one of the movies that listeners recommended that we watch is called Another Earth, and listeners said that the writer Britt Marling, I think co-writer of that, had also co-written and starred in this show, The OA, and they said that was also pretentious. And I actually liked Another Earth quite a bit, so I was like, oh, well, maybe I'll like The OA. And in the course of that panel, Anthony and Sarah both said, well, Anthony said it's super pretentious, that The OA is super pretentious, but I love it. And then Sarah kind of chimed in saying she loves it too. And so I was like, okay, well, yeah, I'll definitely check it out now. At that time, I had absolutely no idea what the show was about at all. A couple of listeners had, requested that we talk about it, but I had no idea what it was about or even what genre it was or who was in it or anything. And then sort of we were in the early stages of that conversation about recording a panel about the OA when it was announced that Netflix had canceled the show after 2 seasons. And so that kind of created a sense of urgency, like, well, we should talk about it now because things are happening and this might be the end of the show and maybe we can do some small part to get it a little more attention or maybe even get it saved in some form, get a capstone episode or something, who knows. So how about let's start with Anthony, and am I quoting you correctly that you said this is super pretentious, but you love it?
I think that is a fair representation of my feelings. When I had said that, I'd only seen the first season of the show, and I think it had sort of become a little blurry in my memory, and that a lot of the sort of details of multiple, and thinking back on it now for this episode, like I think I had mixed feelings about the show while watching that first season in particular, and how I think the pacing was a little off. It just seemed like they were trapped in this one setting, the lab, for a very long time, and so there were specific reservations I had about it, but I felt so strongly that it ended on a really strong note, and that in general, it was just so willing to risk looking dumb or pretentious, and that I really just, admired it for being willing to go there more than anything else.
Yeah, I guess I'll just say, I'll make clear that I went into this with fairly like low to medium expectations because I had sort of heard about it in the context of pretentious TV shows. And it seems like everyone on social media that I asked about it, or pretty much everyone, said that they'd given up on the show at some point in season 2. So I went into this with fairly low expectations, and I actually liked this quite a bit. I thought this was really, really quite good. And so how about Sarah? Did you say that this was pretentious and you loved it, or you just loved it?
I wouldn't, I just loved it. I mean, I don't think I would use the word pretentious just because it does carry such a negative connotation, even though the last time we had that panel, we went into what does pretentious mean to you? And it's one of those nebulous words, right? But I think that, she uses a lot of the tools of things that are associated with pretentiousness. But I think for the most part, it's incredibly gripping. It's incredibly entertaining. The characters are all really well done and lovable, and so it's easy to watch. It's not, it's not the difficult to watch, to slog through, things that we were talking about in that episode about pretentious films.
I guess I should also just explain. Yes, so the show is created by Britt Marling and Zal Botmonglij, and they've done a bunch of feature films together, with him directing and her starring and them writing them together. And so they got this Netflix deal. But Rafael, how much did you know about the OA going into this panel?
Actually, quite a bit. I've been a big Britt Marling fan since Another Earth, 2012 or 2013, I guess. And so I watched season 1 in one night when it first came out, and I actually liked it a lot. So I was really looking forward to season 2. I just didn't get around to it immediately, so I feel bad on that front. But I really enjoyed it, I thought it expanded on the ideas really well.
So what do you think? I totally agree with what Anthony said, that the show risks being silly or, having people not like it. I agree. It does seem to be just an objective fact that it's a very polarizing show, just based on reviews that I've read. What do you think? Did you, Rafael, did you feel like it was, like it's silly, or did you not have that reaction?
I think when you're first watching it, the whole interpretive dance movement thing can throw you a little, but, it's visually pretty interesting. And, I think season 2 did a good job of kind of making it make more sense and make it worthwhile. Overall, I thought it was a really worthwhile show. Kind of reminded me of some other sci-fi shows with good ideas about that sort of thing. I don't want to get too specific yet.
Yeah. How about Sarah? What do you think about the polarizing and the silly aspects of the show?
I think that, it's one of those things, again, I recalled it going back to my art school upbringing and stuff like that, where I'm like, it's unfortunate that something as simple as interpretive dance, it can scare people off. It's unfortunate that, we can't have a show about, a telepathic octopus. I promise I won't get into details of season 2 without people freaking out. And I'm like, come on, you guys, this is the bare bones of fiction. This is why we show up. This is, especially science fiction and speculative fiction. There have been some crazy plots out there that everyone has accepted at face value very quickly, depending, I think, on how it's packaged. And I have some feelings about that. I think, in part, there are a lot of female characters in this show. I think are things to say about how readily we accept crazy plot points depending on how they're packaged, how they're, whether or not they're men that carry them out or whether they're women. But I think that's part of the show. It's one of the reasons why, people have had some conspiracy theories about the cancellation being part of the overall narrative, which unfortunately is probably not true. But it's, they play with us, they play with the audience, and the audience participation is part of it. And I wish that people were just a little more patient and receptive to, just being open-minded about that.
All right, let's set up the story so we can get that out of the way. So the premise of the show is it starts out and we see this woman sort of seemingly wandering dazed on a bridge, and she jumps off the bridge in an apparent attempt to commit suicide. And then she wakes up in a hospital, and her parents come to pick her up, and we find out that she's been missing for 7 years, and that she was blind at the point that she disappeared, and somehow she's regained her sight. And so the police obviously want to know where she's been, but her answers are very sort of spacey, and they get frustrated and say they'll come back in a week once she's had time to collect herself, and maybe her responses will make more sense. And so she, goes back to her childhood home with her parents, and then sort of starts hanging out in this abandoned house, or there's sort of this, they're in this development that never got finished. So there are these empty houses around. And so she starts hanging out in this empty house with these local teenage boys, and one of their, fairly soon, one of their teachers as well, and starts telling them the story of where she's been for the last 7 years. And to make it very quick, she had vision. Oh, boy, it gets really complicated. It turns out she grew up in Russia, and someone tried to kill her because they didn't like her dad, who was an oligarch. Sort of the Russian mob tried to kill her because they didn't like her dad. But she survived, but she went blind in the process. He was killed soon thereafter, and she went to live with her aunt, who then gave her to her parents, who adopted her. And then she had visions. Boy, I didn't really realize how complicated this was going to be before I started talking. But she has visions, and she believes she's going to be reunited with her father. So she goes to the Statue of Liberty, hoping to meet him when she's like 26 or something. But he's not there. She gets kidnapped by the scientist who is performing experiments on her, because she had this near-death experience, which gave her amazing musical ability. And she is imprisoned with a bunch of other people who also have had near-death experiences. So I think I'll stop there. Is everything I just said, is that all correct? Am I missing anything vital there? Anthony?
Seems more or less.
I think that's right. I mean, part of it is that most of this is happening in sort of like, as the show goes on, is happening in this very non-chronological order, because it's her, and then her, like, the present story, and then her telling the story about what's happening to her. So it sort of gets a little shaky, but that it matches everything that I remember.
So Anthony, what did you think of the initial flashbacks where you find out that she's Russian and and almost drowned and all that kind of stuff? What was your reaction to that?
I remember being very taken aback, but in a good way, because this is about an hour, maybe 45 minutes to an hour into a first episode that is like almost feature length. And that, like, we thought like it was one kind of story, and it was about this woman coming back, and suddenly you just get this very lush, like elaborate flashback. And that is also when the opening credits run for the first time. And so there's this just incredible feeling of disorientation, and I have no idea what this show is. I don't know where they're going with this. The details of her Russian childhood, I don't know a lot about the country, so I can't say for certain, but it had this feeling of almost like a tall tale or a fable. And so for a long stretch of the show, I really didn't know whether I was supposed to take that story at face value. So I think I valued it more just for this wild sort of change in tone than I did for the substance of the flashback.
Yeah, it feels like, the flashback is very long, to the point where it finishes and you almost forgot, what was going on in the present of the story. So right from the start, the show is just different and weird, and breaking up traditional TV formats. Sarah, do you have anything you want to add about the flashback and the Russian stuff?
I think it was filmed that way because we're meant to, definitely feel or have, this evocative sense of a memory as when you're a child. And so it reminded me actually of Speak Memory, which was Nabokov's autobiography, and he wrote about being a child in Russia, and that sort of dripping with nostalgia, velvety sense of that made Anthony see it as almost like a fable. I think that was very intentional and a beautiful choice, and you really feel like it's a very real, hyper real thing to her, and was just incredibly transportive. I mean, this is one of those wonderful shows where you're never like tempted to look at your phone, just because it's incredibly transportive, and I think those scenes were very successful.
I would have said that the show would tempt a lot of people to look at their phones. I mean, I didn't have that reaction, but I felt like the show has a lot of character development, and a lot of character development that isn't necessarily directly relevant to advancing the story, and that it does sort of, require a certain amount of patience from the...
Well, I think you have to, it depends on how, if you are interpreting character development to be, what does this have to do with the story? Then yeah, you could totally get bored. But I don't really think that way when I'm watching a series. It's to me, it's like, do these characters feel real? Do they feel complex? Do they feel authentic? And I think they did such a good job of that. The characters themselves are incredibly compelling to me.
Mm-hmm. Well, how about, so I mentioned that she gets kidnapped and locked in this basement. She's in sort of a glass cage with 4 other people. Maybe one of them isn't there at the beginning. But basically 5 other people, or there's 5 of them in these glass cages where they can see each other and talk to each other, but they can't escape. So Rafael, what was your reaction when she gets locked in that glass cell?
In episode 3 of season 1, I guess it's at the end of that one, right? I thought that's when season 1 really kicked off and got really good. 'Cause I remember watching it the first time, and the first couple episodes I thought were all right. But then all of a sudden, next thing I knew, I was watching straight till dawn because I couldn't stop. I thought, that whole 5-6 episode arc to finish the season was really strong, and the experiments and what Jason Isaacs was really up to, Hap, it was interesting because, obviously he's kind of doing it against their will, so he's a little villainous, but he's got some interesting motives.
Yeah, and I agree with you that I found the parts in the basement where they're all prisoners more interesting, or more immediately compelling than the present of the story where she's telling the story to the high school kids. Although, I mean, I liked both things just fine. But one is sort of a thriller, and then one has more of a, it feels very realistic, in a way that not a lot of TV shows do. I mean, the characters all feel like very believable people. And I think because we get so much character development, as I was saying, that isn't necessarily immediately advancing the plot, it just gives it this feeling of real life.
Yeah, I mean, I think in particular, the character of Steve, who's sort of the, kind of the most superficially unlikable one, or even just the most unlikable one, that he's the one who is, the most angry and the most confrontational, but he also is just, I find him incredibly compelling, and honestly, like, I would just watch the Steve show. The others I found as well. I mean, there's I think Buck, the transgender character, this character BBA, who's like an older teacher, pretty much across the board, I found them pretty believable and in many cases compelling. And in fact, I would say that as much as I liked the captivity lab sequences, I did not find those characters as believable or as compelling. And I think that was one of the reasons why, even though I think there's ostensibly more plot in those lab flashbacks, I think I probably enjoyed the present day high school stuff a little bit more just because it felt more real.
Yeah, I agree with you that Steve is a very compelling personality. He's sort of a bully, and he has serious anger management issues, but he has he brings that same intensity to everything he does, and he has sort of a passion that you can't help but like. And then, this character they call BBA, the teacher who sort of falls in with them, is just a really, you don't see a lot of characters like this is sort of a major character in a TV show where she's sort of this weird, lonely, sad, middle-aged woman, but also has this she's just very likable and sort of funny just the way she sees the world, and things she says is kind of unintentionally funny and makes you like her. Sarah, do you agree with those? Do you have similar impressions of those characters, or?
Yeah, I mean, this is, the actress that played BB-8 is the voice actor that they got to do Sadness in Pixar's Inside Out. So it's it's very funny. I mean, she's very well cast, but I feel like she kind of does this glum, funny, lovable character in almost everything I've seen her in. But yeah, I mean, I think that the high school kids are all very sort of genuinely believable high school kids. And, Steve is just sort of this entitled, white boy who's angry for ostensibly no reason. We can't quite figure out yet why he's so angry in the beginning. But, he is influenced by these people that he meets, and, it sort of helps to sharpen his focus and iron him out a little bit, and bring out some of the best aspects of his character. And there's so many things in this show that, they do that are surprising, because they don't handle anything the way that a show, quote unquote, often handles characters like this. So it ends up being really refreshing.
Do you agree with Anthony that the high school characters are more compelling than the prisoner characters?
I think they're equally. I feel like they're equally compelling to me, especially because the characters who are captive are all deeply within the realm of trauma, and so when you meet them, they have already been underground for essentially years, and so it's difficult to say what would be realistic or not in an environment like that, where, most of us have not, hopefully, experienced anything like that. But it certainly seemed, felt true of what I know of trauma survivors. So
yeah.
that part felt very, very real. And especially the way that she talks about it as a writer, like, when she says things like, the biggest mistake I made was believing that if I cast a beautiful net, I'd catch only beautiful things, which there's a lot of moments of just profundity in this show. And I think that's unfortunately part of what makes people repelled by it, like that the sense of it feels like a novel, where people just sort of want to be entertained, and they don't, they sort of feel hostile to this idea. Well, this show is making me think, and I don't want to do that.
I mean, I think that's an interesting point, that the characters would almost the prisoners would almost have to have their personalities worn down from years of captivity, and it would be sort of weird if they were too lively or engaged or something, stuff like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I found it completely believable. It was more just in terms of like who I found it more interesting to spend screen time with. I think the high school, I connected more with the high school students, also because of, just the exact same thing that Sarah's talking about, it, that there's this trauma that defines the prisoners. And in some ways, I think they sort of exist only in this kind of one or two dimensions, whereas the high school students are allowed to be more fully people. And so for that reason, it's not a believability issue, just more of an interest and compellingness issue for me.
See, admittedly, I was kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum there. For me, the OA and the captives from season 1, from all the flashbacks, that's definitely like the meat of the story and the A story. And to me, the high school kids are the B story. And I actually thought it was to the show's detriment that they spent 2 whole episodes on just B story, basically. I would have preferred it format-wise if they kind of interspersed those scenes throughout the other episodes, so we never had to spend too much time with the high school kids, because I was checking out, honestly.
What did you think, Rafael? So OA, the main character, I guess Prairie is how we know her initially. She sort of falls in love with one of her fellow prisoners, this guy Homer, and they can't touch, but they talk to each other through the glass. What did you think of that character Homer in that relationship?
Homer didn't leave a huge impression on me from season 1, but he grew on me a lot in season 2, and I thought that was a pretty interesting story arc. And at first, I was admittedly confused. She's still trying to get through to this guy, and I didn't really understand the purpose, because she was too smart and she should have realized that it was impossible. But the way they took that story was a pretty interesting direction. And, I should have had more faith in it.
All right. Well, we'll get to season 2 in a second. So we find out, were you surprised, Rafael, or what did you think when we find out about the experiments and the drowning Homer over and over again and stuff like that?
I thought visually it was really interesting, and even just the fact he was only submersing their heads, but obviously it reminded me of Flatliners to some degree, thematically pretty similar, like dying just to skirt the edge of death and see what's on the other side. And, the idea of forcing people to do it. And I mean, that's the big difference between that other movie and this. I thought the experiment and the science behind it was pretty interesting. Even though he's kind of a bastard since he didn't exactly take volunteers.
Yeah, I haven't seen Flatliners, but yeah, that occurred to me while I was watching it. I mean, I sort of vaguely know what it's about. That it's about these medical students who are doing experiments on themselves where they die and resuscitate each other.
Pretty much, they keep pushing themselves to go for longer and longer. You should check out the original. Skip the remake. I did.
I watched the trailer for the remake, and they one of the details in is it says that they come back with extraordinary artistic abilities. I don't know if that's something that is sort of part of near-death experience lore or not, or if does that originate in Flatliners, or does anyone have any idea where that idea originates?
I think with Flatliners, they were always it was a little bit of an odd film because it's kind of a horror film, but it's not at the same time. It's kind of just a character drama. I mean, because essentially they brought back a piece of them from every time a character would go into the afterlife briefly, an element of their past would kind of haunt them, but to varying degrees of success, I think, for the story. I don't know. But it's an interesting movie overall and great cast.
Yeah, Anthony or Sarah, do you know anything about near-death experiences? Ever had a near-death experience? Are you having a near-death experience right now?
I have not. I've certainly had sort of premonitions that came true, things like that. And I think one of the things that this show is about is, the unexplainable mysteries. And that's part of what makes it so compelling, because we've all had, experiences like that we just can't explain. Even just something like a strong sense of deja vu, that kind of thing. And I do think that one of the strong suits of the show, before we go on to the next season, is Hap. I think Jason Isaacs is a remarkably complex villain in especially season 1, because he's just so... You can see why she gets trapped in the beginning, because he is incredibly charismatic, obviously very good at getting people to trust him, very smart, but has this, very clinical sense of justification for what he's doing, and he's doing unspeakably horrific things, and yet, he is not being treated as a 2D villain at all, and there's a lot of 2D villains in television and films these days. And to see a truly fleshed out villain that is frightening in his compartmentalization, his ability to just say, well, this is wrong, but this isn't, and I can treat these people as disposable, but not this, and to be able to tread that line in service of his obsession with his science project and his career was very believable and very interesting. So it's just really nice to see this, very deep, very, well thought out villain character.
Oh, I agree with that. The best antagonists always think they're doing the right thing. And between the writing and Jason Isaacs just being brilliant, it definitely comes across. You can feel every time he relates to his captives in a very kind of personal human way, you can tell he thinks he's the good guy, So that's great.
Yeah.
Well, and he has a fairly reasonable utilitarian argument for what he's doing, right? Because he's sort of I want to remove the fear of death from 7 billion people, and if that means imprisoning 5 people for 7 years, isn't that a worthwhile trade-off? Which, yeah, from a utilitarian standpoint, I could maybe kind of buy, but I always got the sense that wasn't really what was driving him. That what was driving him was more personal ambition sort of power, lust for power kind of stuff. I guess that gets into season 2, so maybe I shouldn't go too far down that road, but I will.
It's a really interesting ethical question because it reminds me of Minority Report or something. If it stops murder across the country, should 3 people be essentially locked up against their will? That's the same thing, really.
Yeah, Anthony, what do you think about that?
Yeah,
Would you lock up 5 people in a dungeon for fear of death from everybody?
I mean, it also reminds me of, I think, probably my favorite short story, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. I think this is sort of an ongoing question, the needs of the many versus the needs of the few. I think I would say that for me, what was more compelling about Hap was more just, like you said, both that he had this justification and that at the same time he was a person, that he was clearly had ambition and greed and, anger. And that didn't like obviate the idea that he had ideals as well, but he just felt, maybe the most human of any of the characters on the show. And, I like in general the arc that they took him on, that I think a number of television shows and also the Marvel movies, there's this temptation, I think, to as villains kind of stick around, they become softened and they become sort of more like anti-heroes or allies of the heroes. And I think in this case, they did something really smart of continuing to reveal dimensions of sort of a loaded choice of word here, but they reveal different aspects of him without ever sort of soft pedaling the monstrousness of what he was doing. Like there was no trying to apologize for what he was. I didn't get the sense that the showrunners wanted us to think, oh, he's doing the right thing. They wanted us just to say, oh, he has a point of view, but what he's doing is terrible, and I think that's true throughout the entire show.
Yeah, I guess there's one other very important thing I should explain that I didn't. So when Prairie almost dies as a child, she loses her sight because she has this near-death experience, and she kind of travels to the astral plane and meets this woman, Katoon, who says, I'm going to take away your sight because what you're going to protect you from the horrors of what you're going to see, or something like that. And then later when she's an adult and she's imprisoned by Hap, at one point she almost escapes, or she escapes out into the woods, and he smacks her in the back of the head. When he catches her, he smacks her in the back of the head with a rifle butt. And then it happens again, and she gets taught this sort of series of gestures that have some sort of mystical import, and her sight is restored at that point. I might have some of the details wrong, but I think that's basically what happens.
I have a theory about that character, but I can't actually get into it until we talk about season 2.
Okay, well, we'll come back to that. Actually, now that you say that, I think I might know what your theory is that hadn't occurred to me before. But yeah, so what did Sarah? What did you think of the gestures? They're called, what are they called? The movements or something like that?
Yeah, the movements.
Yeah, the movements.
Yeah, I mean, again, like the idea that they're good enough at, we were talking in the pretentious panel about how, it sometimes seems as if films are either too commercial or not commercial enough to hold your interest. And, that thing that we define as commercialism is just the ability to entertain more people than, a very, very, very small percentage. And, not being afraid of using those things that those commonalities to tell a story. And I think she's very good at that, Marling and, the other creator. So I do think that, the fact that they have interpretive dance, the fact that has something to do with the story, they take it seriously in the show. And so you take it seriously as an audience. I think that within the reality they set up, it's believable, and I don't think that I ever thought, well, this is silly. I think I thought, wow, it's really a testament to how good this show is that I don't think it's silly.
Right. I will say, I mean, I guess I'll just mention, so the climax of season 1 is that Prairie has taught these magical gestures to the high school students and revealed that they have the power to bring people back to life and open portals through time and space and things like that. And so the high school kids are all at school, and the school shooter shows up, and they start spontaneously kind of doing the gestures because they're trapped. It's the only thing that they can do. And this, depending on your interpretation, either sort of has some magical influence in freezing the shooter, or just sort of baffles him and gives one of the cafeteria workers a chance to tackle him. But at that moment where they all stood up and started doing the things, that was a moment where I was like, oh, I might laugh at this. But I didn't. Like, I ended up sort of turning a corner into like, actually, I kind of love this. But I was very, very close to kind of laughing at that part.
I feel you on that. And, that reminds me, the one thing I really did love about the way season 1 wrapped up was the sense of ambiguity. There was two different viewpoints that people were debating, and it's not really a debate anymore, but whether or not she was lying, the books that they found under her bed, that whole thing, or if it was all factual and really happening, And to your point, if the movements had anything to do with the shooter being stopped, or it was just a distraction.
Mm-hmm. What did, Anthony, what did you think of the idea that the show kind of tries to make it ambiguous whether her story is to be believed or not?
I actually did not find that particularly interesting as an ambiguity within the show. I think it was fine as, planting the seeds of doubt within the other characters, that of course they would kind of be asking each other, like, why are we listening to this person? It would basically just, listening to the delusions of, someone with mental illness. So that was fine. I didn't mind it, but I would say that to me, the more interesting ambiguity was more just the question of what is it that they're experiencing? And so that, having that question open, I think to me was a really powerful, sort of ambiguity at the end of the first season versus, the question of, did she imagine it, or, she just basically delusional, and did she get shot and die? I guess that didn't strike me as a very interesting ending. If it was in my head, it was never really a possibility that she died, or that there was that she might die, and then there was, something that happened afterwards, but that she literally had just imagined the whole thing and then died. I don't think I ever really seriously entertained that possibility.
No, I agree with that, because there just seems to be so much. I mean, she was blind and her sight came back. She's talks to dogs. She just happens to be standing there at the moment that they do the gestures, and there just seems to be so much stuff that I agree. And even to the fact that when French, one of the high school kids, suddenly doubts everything, that seemed very odd to me. I didn't feel like someone who had invested so much and risked so much to follow this person would pull a 180 like that just because he found some books. That the whole book thing didn't really seem to mean much to me.
But French was the character that, was sort of constantly straddling between this desire to be normal, whatever that is, and be accepted in society and be successful, and escape from, this upbringing he had that, is troubled, and, his mom is kind of drunk all the time, and, that kind of thing. And I feel like that's one of the major themes of the show, where they have, a lot of these scenes play out in front of an Applebee's, inside of an Olive Garden, and I think that they are, making an interesting commentary on, this idea of suburbia as this normalized place, and how if you deviate from that, in any way, that you are sort of persecuted. And that leads very nicely with the themes of, discovery, and the themes of the school shooter and stuff like that. So to me, it made sense.
Mm-hmm. But did anyone seriously doubt that anything supernatural was going on in this show, and that this was just going to be a show about a mentally ill person who's...
Well, no, not in so many words. I mean, the moment you knew there was a second season, that theory kind of went out the window. But it's one of those things where the ambiguity is just fun. If it had never continued, because then it's kind of who the hell knows? You could make a case for either. But obviously, the show did continue, so it's pretty conclusive.
And I don't think that they put that element of doubt in there for the audience. I think that they put it in as part of the theme of, what belief and faith and listening to somebody is, what it is to listen to a trauma survivor, that kind of thing. And so it's more about the characters, having an excuse suddenly to doubt and what that looks like. And that, I think, was very realistic than it is about the audience feeling a sense of doubt.
Mm-hmm. All right. So as Rafael was saying, the story continues in season 2. Also very complicated. So let's see. So, so Prairie wakes up. She's been shot and dies in an ambulance, and wakes up in an alternate dimension where things are slightly different. You know, like Joe Biden is the president rather than Barack Obama, and stuff like that. And she is now a version of herself who didn't have a near-death experience as a girl. So she's not known to anyone as Prairie Johnson. She's known to everyone by her birth name of Nina Azarova. And she lives in a penthouse apartment, and her father had lived into old age. And she had been dating this like very wealthy, influential tech guy. Oh, wait, I don't think I wrote. Did I write his? Oh, Pierre Ruskin. And the two of them have gotten up to something weird, but she doesn't know what it is because she doesn't remember. She has no access to any of Nina's memories. And so it's sort of like an amnesia storyline almost, where she's going around trying to figure out what she's been up to in this alternate life. And then there's also a storyline where there's a private investigator, Kareem Washington, and he is hired to find a missing girl who we recognize as an alternate world version of Buck, the transgender high school student that we recognize from the other dimension, from the original dimension. And then we also follow the high school students in the original dimension in the aftermath of Prairie's death from their point of view as they try to sort of make sense of what's happened and reestablish contact with her in this other dimension. Is that a pretty... does that set up most of the stuff we need to talk about?
Makes no mention of the octopus, Dave.
Well, wait, we'll get to... Believe me, Sarah, we will get to the octopus. So how about Rafael? What were your... You just watched season 2.
I did.
Today, basically, right?
Basically, like overnight. I haven't slept.
Yeah.
It seems like the right state of mind.
So what was your what was your initial impression of how it compared with season 1?
You know, I was a little skeptical going into it, but right off the bat, it kind of drew me in with the Kareem storyline because, like Anthony alluded to earlier, it was kind of, aside from that very brief flashback, a 20-second flashback with Britt Marling by the side of the road, it was taking us down this new storyline. It was kind of like, all right, I'm not sure where this is going. But then the whole way that the game kind of tied into the house, and the house tied into the work by the tech guru Ruskin, and then his relationship with Percy, Hap, and Asylum, it all started to coalesce pretty well. Really.
Actually, let me just explain that for people who haven't seen the show, or maybe are still confused, even having seen the show. So, right. So, Prairie in the body of Nina Azarova very quickly finds herself committed to a mental institution, and her the people who were prisoners with her, in the glass cages are now imprisoned with her in this mental institution, and this guy Hap, the doctor, has jumped into the body of the head of the mental hospital, and it's the same. It's the same guy. In this, same body in this timeline. He became the head of this mental hospital, but now he has all the memories from the previous dimension, just like she does, and actually all the prisoners do, except for Homer, the prisoner that she's in love with. He has jumped into this new world, but the memories of the body from this world have kind of overwritten his personality, so he doesn't recognize her. And yeah, I think that hopefully that explains it. So sorry, go ahead, Rafael, were you going to say something else?
Oh, no, just basically that. I thought that was a great reveal at the end of episode 1. I mean, I suppose it was predictable enough that Jason Isaacs would pop up again in a prominent way, but I thought that was a great way to get the story going forward.
Mm-hmm. How about Anthony? What were your kind of initial impressions of season 2?
I think I came into it kind of similar to Rafael, where I was a little skeptical, not because I had any specific objections to the direction they were taking it in, but because I just liked the way season 1 ended so much that it seemed to me like season 1 had ended in this sort of very classic kind of like slingshot ending where, it was sort of open to this in the future in a way that was very satisfying for me as a viewer, that like, it's like, I don't want to see what comes next, because that to me felt like the end of the story. And so going into it, I was like, oh, this feels a little bit unnecessary, a little bit redundant. But by starting with this whole other storyline, I think it really, again, kind of took me by surprise. And so I was like pulled in fairly quickly. And I mean, because there are so many plots, I would say that this season does feel like it takes a little while to get going. But overall, like, very quickly I was won over, and I was like, I'm in. I want to see where this is going. I mean, in particular, just kind of seeing where this, because they set up this mystery with the house and wanting to understand what was happening with the house. I think that really pulled me in very quickly.
Here's probably the best compliment I can give season 2. If you told me just after season 1 there'd be 5 seasons, I'd say that's crazy. Like, where could the story possibly go? But now, having seen season 2, I feel like it's a real loss, essentially, because it had so many possibilities.
All right, let me just, sorry, now I have to explain about the house. So there's the video game, and kids are playing it, and there's all these clues. It's sort of this, it jumps into real life, and it's like a scavenger hunt that ultimately the hints lead to this abandoned house in San Francisco that is sort of this weird haunted house kind of place. And so one thing I thought was interesting, given how many people, as I said going into this, so many people had said that they dropped out in season 2. But just looking at Rotten Tomatoes, I think the ratings for season 1 were 77%, and then season 2 were like 94%, if I'm remembering correctly. So there's certainly a lot of people out there who think that season 2 is much stronger. But so how about Sarah? How did you think season 2 compared with season 1 in terms of quality?
I loved it, and I think that it's very, it's very strange to say that this show is at all super realistic, but it is super realistic in terms of its deep dive into the subcultures of the Bay Area, and all of that was incredibly believable. Like, I spent some time living in San Francisco. I moved out to San Francisco 7 years ago to join a tech startup, and a friend of mine actually said, well, good luck with your little cult, because we were all going to be living and working in the same building. And I sort of laughed it off, and when I got there, I was like, oh. And, within a month or so, somebody had invited me to like a sub-Burning Man party. So in addition to Burning Man, throughout the year, they have these crazy parties that are often themed, where people walk around reciting scripts and reading poetry. And there are just a lot of really rich and strange little subcultures of communities in San Francisco. And the collision of those communities with the tech bros is 100% real. And so to me, I felt like, as strange as the show is, that season 2 especially was just like, yes, I 100% believe that this is happening right now in San Francisco.
I agree with that totally, with like a specific example. That scene where Homer goes on the date, it didn't really push the story forward in any way, but it felt extremely authentic.
Yeah, yep.
So, Sarah, did you ever get invited to one of those telepathic octopus nightclub parties?
I mean, it came pretty close. Like, there was one party where we all had to wear red, and we ended up, there was like a mariachi band, and we were all, in a march holding a fake coffin. And so we were all sort of, holding up this coffin, going in a line. And, I just sort of went for the, experiment of it. But, I had only really scratched the surface, and just enough to see how deep the rabbit hole went. And there are strange parties. There's people that get together just to cuddle. I mean, there's a lot of drugs and a lot of money, and a lot of people who feel sort of disenfranchised and are trying to, expel themselves from this world that they're actively participating in and try to see themselves beyond it. And there's a lot of tech bros who are trying to save the world in, less than ethical ways. And so it's just, I find this whole story like it's just nonfiction to me, which is hilarious to say about something that out there, but it's true.
Well, why don't you just explain, Sarah, about the telepathic giant octopus, like for people who haven't seen the show?
she goes to this, so there's way too much to describe about how she gets to this place where she, has this key that goes to a certain place that she can access, and she has this phone number she can call, but she doesn't know what it does because she doesn't have those memories. And she finds out that when she calls this phone number, she goes to this club that's hidden behind like this other club. And so it's a very exclusive thing, which again felt 100% authentic. And she goes and she is apparently part of the entertainment where she gets, sort of hooked up to this octopus that's kept in a tank, and does things to her and with her. But
she basically acts as a medium so that the octopus can speak to the audience. Exactly.
Yeah. And that was, and that's why she has these like suction cup scars on her arm in the very first episode. But yeah, it's completely strange and yet utterly believable.
I mean, for me, this was another one of those moments like the cafeteria shooter scene in season 1, where I was like this close to being like, this is too silly, but then I took a swerve and so like, this is actually kind of awesome. But how about Anthony? Did you think that scene was awesome or silly?
I thought it was awesome. I mean, I agree with you that there, especially going into the scene, there's this like slightly sinking feeling of, oh my God, they're going to do tentacle porn, like seriously. And then it's just shot so beautifully. There's no winking at the audience. It's, the octopus, presumably it's not a real octopus, but it feels like it's there. The voice the actor who plays the voice of the octopus, just the detail that he's like, oh, my name is Azrael, but like, you call me Old Night, and there's like no explanation for why that is. I just think like, there's this kind of confidence about when the show is making a big ask. It doesn't try to like, hold your hand or soft pedal it. It just says, yes, we are going to have a school shooting and they're going to fight it with interpretive dance. We are going to have, a telepathic octopus who communicates to her through his suction cups. Just go with it. And I really like that. And I mean, but partly is because it's so artfully done. It's like just, to me, like that whole episode that surrounds it is just incredibly beautifully shot. Like it's just so full of, mystery and it's just like really just completely suspenseful and so like when you see that I don't know, the whole thing just worked so well for me, even though objectively I sort of stand back. It's like, oh, if I tried to describe this to my friends, I would sound like a crazy person.
Yeah.
Well, and as Sarah was saying, I mean, there's a huge, like, it takes her a long time to get there, and you have no idea what's going to happen when she get there, and there's all these steps, and there's all this suspense building, and all this mystery building, and to my mind, it pays off. But Rafael, what do you think? Are you pro-octopus or anti-octopus?
Very, very pro-octopus. It reminded me of the boar gullet from Star Wars, actually. But I thought the whole thing was really well done, the way it builds up the suspense there, because, they tie her to the chair and you have no idea what's happening, and then all of a sudden you see people gathering on the other side of the curtain. I thought the whole reveal was just really well done. And, I just like it when shows like this kind of surprise you by going a little, out there. So it was fun. Mm-hmm. I did have a couple questions like that are logic based if we want to delve into them. Okay. They're very specific on the writing. But I don't know if we want to. But
why don't you give us one? What's one?
Okay. Well, like the whole clue. She wound up there because they discerned that the clue syzygy led to the phone number in her phone, right? But how would that have helped anyone else playing the game? Were other people in the game in the audience? Then that'll eventually leads them to solve the mystery and get into the house. It kind of seemed like that was a clue specific only for her. The whole three wise man thing,
Well, syzygy was the name of the laundromat that was the front for the club. So I guess somebody could have found it. I'm not sure. I mean, I personally found the game clues sort of not that interesting or believable.
It would have led everyone to the club, which is also the secret entrance to the house. So regardless of whether or not they can communicate with the octopus, that's still how you get into the house.
That's true. Good point.
Yeah. If we're going to have sort of like some criticisms, one of my big sort of pet peeves is police officers or private investigators who like risk their lives, freedom, careers for this case for no particular reason that I can see. And I sort of felt like that with Kareem, that he's committing just multiple felonies, everything he does. And it's like if this is how he operates as a private investigator, how is he not in jail already? But
isn't that why he's a private investigator? Like, I feel like there's a lot of every private investigator in stories is like this. They're sort of on the fringes, and the police sort of barely tolerate them, but work with them because they recognize that they can do things that the police can't do. So I feel like they kind of, that is the role of a private investigator, and that people who are sort of have obsessive personalities are drawn to that career because that is what makes them good at it.
But so Sarah, so when he breaks Prairie out of the mental institution, that didn't strain plausibility for you?
Not really.
Well, you know what strained plausibility for me
he lives
is
on a houseboat. Like, he doesn't have a family. You don't see him, like, go home at night to his wife and kids and kiss them goodnight. He has a very, like, isolated life. He's not a normal guy. And then it turns out, as the plot, develops, that he is part of the story.
Well, to your point, though, David, where it lost realism points for me a little is the aftermath of that. Because, the whole breakout kind of just got out of control. Eventually, he was just trying to sneak her out initially. But then afterwards, they immediately just go and chill out at her apartment for a long time. Right. And it's like, come on, that's the first place the cops would check. And they kind of, allude to that because they say, oh, a patrol car went by. But it's like, come on. That's like the cops would have been there.
I think they were trying to make a point there about rich people and how they live in a different realm than us, because like this woman Nina has a tremendous amount of money, and she travels in circles of people who have a tremendous amount of money. The whole thing is being oversaw by Ruskin on some level, and so you get the sense that if Pierre Ruskin wanted her to be arrested for breaking out, he would, that kind of thing. And then there's the doctor, the Jason Isaacs' Hap character, who also kind of has a little bit of that power. And so I don't think it was meant to be interpreted as this traditional thing where you're wondering, well, why aren't the cops breaking in? Because it's like, well, they're not, because she's wealthy and she's living this in a completely different world with completely different rules than the rest of us would.
Sure.
I guess I don't completely buy that because, or at least that's not how I read it, because there's no scene where we can see the mechanics of that working. All we see are Jason Isaacs saying, you got to go after her. Make sure you keep emphasizing that, she's dangerous. And then that really never pays off in any way. It's more just, there's a cop car that drives by once in a while. And so to me, that read much more as we're not particularly interested in investigating the sort of fallout of the police coming after her. We just want this to be a sort of low level, threat in the background. And to me, it read more as just, wow, the cops are really bad at their jobs.
Sure. Because, maybe she's rich and has immunity effectively, but the detective had just assaulted like 3 orderlies. They would have been coming after him, you'd think.
All right. So there's like so much more plot here. It sort of intimidates me to even think about it. But just to quickly, just to sort of touch on some of it. So it turns out that I think Pierre Ruskin had been financing experiments where people had their dreams analyzed, and they looked for patterns, and the patterns had either led them to this house or given them some clues about how to deal with this haunted house. And then Nina had given him the idea to create this virtual reality game to lead kids to the house so that they could try to solve what was going on in it. The dream messages were also telling them that that the house somehow wanted Kareem to go there. He goes there at one point and has this sort of like haunted house hallucinogenic experience, which is later explained as possibly being, toxic gas emanating from the ground or something. And also it turns out that Hap has kidnapped the high school kids from this second dimension and has them floating in a tank or like a pool where there's like weird alien plants growing in them. And this is somehow allowing him to map the mycelial network. No, sorry, that's Star Trek. The dimensions. And he also meets this woman, Elodie, who's like someone who habitually jumps from dimension to dimension. And as a result of that interaction, he gets his hands on these cubes that sort of unfold mechanically and enact the movements so that you don't need friends. You can just do it all by yourself.
See now, yeah, these were some of the best parts of season 2, I think you just touched on.
All right, so why don't you pick up on that, Rafael?
Well, I particularly love the character of Elodie. I thought that was really fascinating right off the bat. And you probably picked up on the theory I was going to allude to. Can you guess?
Well, so when you said it earlier, I thought you were going to say that Khatun is Elias Rahim, who we haven't even mentioned yet, but is the FBI agent. But no, you're going to say something else. You're going to say she's Khatun?
Possibly. I mean, that was my first thought, and I guess it's still in play for the time being. She just seems to have so much information about this, and just the fact that Khatun didn't make an appearance or a mention really in season 2. I don't know. Maybe it's too obvious in hindsight, but it could work. But I thought the whole thing with her being able to hop into multiple realities, as many as 14 possibly, according to that final scene, that was a great reveal. With those little boxes. It did leave me wondering, though, does she have to, like, recreate those boxes every time she hops to a new reality? I don't know.
Okay, so in a second, we're going to get to what happens when Kareem Washington makes it kind of to the heart of the haunted house. But before we talk about that, is there anything else about all the stuff I just mentioned, Anthony, that you wanted to touch on?
Maybe we should talk a little bit about Pierre Ruskin, because he is this character who's in the background of most of the season, and they've sort of very ostentatiously don't show you his face, but he's clearly like the puppet master, behind a lot of what's happening. He's also the sort of unseen boyfriend of Prairie in this universe, named Nina. And then so at the very end of the second to last episode, Kareem finally meets him, and he is played by Vincent Kartheiser, I think is his name, from Mad Men. And he basically just has this one scene where I think, it's a perfectly good scene, but I think in terms of things that I sort of quibble with or have reservations about in the second season, I thought that was not a very satisfying payoff to these 7 episodes of build up to this, incredible mastermind. And then when we see him, I mean, I think it ties into some of the thematic stuff that Sarah is talking about, that he has a very similar view of progress that Hap does, that, that you can sort of go through, that the progress is built on like bloodshed and pain and conquest and this idea that, of course, like 5 people, that the way you get there is through 5 people suffering. And he has so I think in some ways he echoes who Hap is, but as a character, he sort of felt a little bit disappointing just because we'd heard so much about him, and then we saw him this one time in a reasonably good scene, and then, basically disappears from the narrative.
And he doesn't know really anything about the house that we don't already know, right? Like, he's trying to figure it out still at this point in the story.
The one thing he knows is that Kareem, for some reason, is the person who's going to solve it. And he's the one who shows Kareem that there's actually this 4th element to the dreams that Marlowe didn't tell him about, which is that Kareem himself is everyone, saw Kareem in their dreams, and so he's sort of destined to be the one who solves the house.
Right, but the house is just basically magic or a haunted house or something, right? We don't...
Yeah, I think that's fair.
I mean, because you said you were is that you were disappointed just because he's too similar to Hap, or is there more to it? Why you?
Or just I just thought there would be more to him as a character. But it felt like, and I mean, I'm glad we spent more time with Hap, because ultimately Hap is the character that I'm invested in. It just felt like if you're going to have this character who everyone is talking about for roughly 7 hours of the show, and then you show him for one scene, like, I feel like there's so much build-up and there's so much expectation that it's not so much that I thought it was bad or wasn't, that it was sort of careless or anything like that. It just felt like, in some ways, a little bit of a red herring, where I was like, oh, okay, that's Pierre Ruskin, that's fine. That seems not really to be where the show is invested in for this, wrapping up this story.
Yeah. Sarah, what did you think of Pierre Ruskin?
I think he was totally believable. And I think, again, it sort of alludes to this subcultures of Silicon Valley and these overlords that are very sort of cool and collected and doing all of these, unethical things that they've cleared with their lawyer. But I do think that we haven't seen the last of him, or wouldn't if the show is allowed to continue. I think that, people, I think, to expect that it would be wrapped up in that scene, when to me that scene was almost like an introduction to the character. Like, even though we've seen him, without seeing him, in the original couple of episodes of season 2, that's really the introduction to the character, right? And so it follows that we would see him again. And I don't know, whether we would see him in season 3 or whatever. Obviously, we don't see him again in this season. But I do think it tracks for the inner logic of the story to have these sort of puppet masters in the background that we're not meant to entirely understand yet.
Well, and to your earlier point about Nina Azarova, right? He basically says, feel free to record me confessing all my sins. Take it to the police, see how far you get with that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I liked
great.
his cool confidence there. I mean, basically the guy was there to implicate him, but instead he just kind of led him along, and then that reveal that the guy was the fourth thing in the dream, the commonality. So that was cool.
All right, so let's talk about what happens when Kareem makes it to the rose stained glass window in the house, which is sort of the heart of the house. And so it kind of opens up, and basically it turns out that, so there's also this, before that there's this scene where OA confronts Hap, and he's created somehow, I don't know how he did this so quickly, but he's created sort of giant duplicates of those cube things that open up and perform the movements. And so he's able to transport the two of them to exactly the dimension that he wants. And it turns out that exactly the dimension that he wants is a dimension in which the OA is a TV show starring Britt Marling and Jason Isaacs. And, she jumps into Britt Marling and he jumps into Jason Isaacs. In this version, they're married. And so we're given the idea that this is his sort of dream scenario for seducing her and making her doubt that any of her previous lives were real, because she's going to think that it's all just a TV show. As I was watching this, I was just like, no. Like, what are you doing? Now that I've thought about it, now that I've had some time to process a little bit, I can kind of justify going in this direction. But Rafael, I think you said you watched this scene right before we started recording, right? So it's still fresh for you. So how did you react to that scene?
Yeah, no, you're right. It's very fresh, so I'm still processing as well. But my reaction was similar to yours. I was like, wow, this is really meta and interesting, and yet I kind of hate it. It just didn't feel right. But, they've earned the benefit of the doubt. I'm really curious to see where it would have gone, or if it still does somehow. But yeah, that was a hell of a twist. I didn't see that coming.
And Anthony, you just watched this, yesterday?
Yesterday, yeah. And I would say that I wasn't crazy about it. It was relatively, you see like basically one or two scenes taking place in this new dimension, this more sort of meta storyline, but it isn't a big part of it. And so I was skeptical, I would say, and I remain skeptical about it, but as like the ending to that episode, I didn't hate it. I wasn't completely won over either.
Sarah, what do you think?
I was fine with it, and part of it is that I understood from the style of the show, that they're going to pull something crazy out at the 11th hour. Like that's what they do. It's one of the characteristics of the show that sort of repeats itself, and I think that it would. If I've ever seen a breaking of the fourth wall in anything, this did it the most successfully for me. But for me, it felt pretty real. And you're talking about international travel. It's only natural that you would also talk about actresses and the idea of assuming different identities and so on. So it didn't shock me in a bad way.
Well, you say the 11th hour, and this is, I guess, the 11th hour of season 2, but it's
right.
It's like the, I don't know, 5th hour or something of the whole 5-season arc, and it just makes me wonder if this is what they're doing, at the end of season 2, what's the plan for, like, how do you top that at the end of seasons 3, 4, and 5?
Right, but you asked yourself that same question at the end of season 1, right? Like, you could never have imagined that everything that happened in season 2 would be the natural extension of season 1 and connect with it so well. And, you know, it's just it's such a shame that people and I feel like people, because of the way that Hollywood is structured, we get into these situations where you have showrunners throw in crazy, fantastical elements to a story that make all the fan theory websites light up like a Christmas tree and then go nowhere because of the way that shows are sort of written, most shows are sort of written and planned as they happen. And this wasn't. And it's such a sad thing to potentially lose that, because, you know, we really should have more shows that are planned out from the beginning. And I feel like people get this fatigue, you know, Lost fatigue, because they you know, Lost sort of is the one that most famously did this. There were all of these fantastical elements, fascinating details that came out every season that led absolutely nowhere. And then the very last episode was just a joke. You know, and half the fan theories on Reddit were infinitely better than what they came up with. And, you know, again, it happened with Game of Thrones, where the showrunners...
Wait, no spoilers,
because they
I haven't
lost...
seen it.
Okay, I won't say it, but
I'm waiting
suffice
for
to
the
say,
books, goddammit.
you have seen the internet, yeah,
Good luck.
so I feel like it's pretty unavoidable at this point.
Well, so Anthony, what do you think about what Sarah... are you buying Sarah's defense of this crazy twist?
I mean, I agree that it in the sense that, to a certain extent, it seems clearly that it was setting up something else, and so it's sort of hard to judge on its own. And so that's why I wasn't like, you know, metaphorically throw the TV across the room, or the iPad I was watching it on, but more just like, my response was more just kind of, okay, well, this seems like a very dangerous direction to go in, but, you know, I certainly they've earned my trust, and so I'm willing to go along with it. I think, in general, my feelings about the 2 seasons of the show that we did get were almost inverse, in that season 1, I think, for the most part, I admired it, but wasn't necessarily fully engaged or in love with it. And then the final episode completely won me over. Even, you know, like that I just found it, even though, again, there was this sort of edging into silliness, but it was like, to me, like, tremendously moving. And it's like hard for me even to talk about that final scene without like getting, you know, kind of emotionally overwhelmed again. And then my reaction to the second season was, I think this is, as a season of television, much stronger, and one of my favorite, you know, seasons of TV on Netflix. I mean, I thought it was just pretty much terrific, and including large stretches of the finale, except that it led to this thing that made me go kind of, okay, well, it would have been cool to see where they went with it. On its own, it's an okay ending, but I'm not, you know, certainly nowhere near as sort of excited or impressed by it as I was by the season 1 finale.
Yeah, let me say, because I just feel like suspension of disbelief is such a evanescent sort of thing, and you know, like in a zombie movie, right? Like, you know, why don't the characters ever say like, oh, this seems like a zombie movie? And it's like, well, because if they said that, then it'd be like, well, wow, this does seem like a zombie movie. Maybe we're in a zombie movie. Hey, you look like Tom Cruise. Like, oh, hey, you look just like Woody Harrelson. It's like the whole thing just, you know, once you pull that first little thread out, the whole thing just kind of unravels. And so I think, like dangerous, Anthony, you said is a good word to use.
Right.
That it's like, you know, do you just risk completely breaking the spell by just so foregrounding the artifice of what's happening?
Yeah, and to echo the previous thoughts, it definitely could have worked, and I'm sure they had a good plan, but it seems like a step too far, because you've got this whole sliding doors motif with, you know, Nina/Prairie, and it's easy to see how, like, you know, she lived 2 separate lives that were similar, based in the same original life, but it's like, then how do you go to all of a sudden she's just portraying a character called Nina/Prairie, isn't it? And that seems like a really big leap.
So I think that one way to think about the way that OA is structured, though, and I think it's one of the things that sets people off, right, is that the very last episode it would be in any other TV show the very first episode of the next season. They do this thing where they, other TV shows have cliffhangers, right? And if you ended the OA on the, say, each episode has 8 episodes, I think. If you ended it on the 7th episode, then it would be a cliffhanger, right? Because we don't know what happened. And instead of merely introducing a cliffhanger, they say, we're going to throw a damn wrench into the whole story we just told, which is always immediately followed up and picked back up in the next season. But that's a tremendously ballsy thing to do. And not a lot of television shows do that. Even though other television shows end on cliffhangers, they do it in a traditional way that people understand. And OA does not. They're just like, nope, we're gonna start telling the next story before we get there. And, that frustrates a lot of people. I am not one of them, and I desperately wish that people were a little more patient. But I feel like structurally, if you think of it that way, if you think of it as this last episode is always the first episode of the next season, then it makes more sense.
I'm just sort of like projecting in my head what would season 3 be, and I just imagine like all these like production meetings and like all this. Like it's just hard for me to imagine like that going on for too long before I just can't buy this anymore. I mean, like maybe if this is just like 1 or 2 episodes and then they go to something else, I could sort of like, be like, okay, that was cool and interesting. But like if this is all of season, I mean, I would be unbelievably fascinated to see if they could pull it off. But just in my mind, I just don't picture it working.
If I had to guess, they probably spend very little time in that universe. They probably move on quickly or something.
Yeah, I mean, they did the same thing at the end of season 1. Did they then dwell on suburbia and school shootings in season 2? No. Right? So you gotta have patience and faith of the existing structure, based on what
I'm a rationalist, Sarah. I don't believe in fear.
Now, that said, to Sarah's point about them being ballsy, that's definitely true. But I think you could also say slightly reckless, like narratively, to kind of, this is 2 times in a row they left the season on kind of an unforgivable cliffhanger if it doesn't continue. And I think you have to take that into account. Like, I don't think you can just assume you're going to get renewed. Try and find the balance a little better.
Well, every other show does it, in fairness. Like, the absolutely horrible Another Life that just came out, they ended on a pretty big cliffhanger and just assume that the story is going to continue. A lot of science fiction that, is working with this larger idea. Battlestar Galactica did it.
Sure.
I mean,
but I think Another Life was wrapped up a lot better, though. I mean, I actually love that show, but if there was never another episode, it's kind of just a prelude to a bigger story, but it doesn't end on a cliffhanger per se. I mean, it's...
I would argue that the season 1 of this show, actually, I mean, I can understand why that felt like a cliffhanger to a lot of people, but if the show had ended there, that to me would have been a perfectly self-contained story. Then that would have been the perfect ending to that story.
Right.
I mean, I don't mind cliffhangers, honestly, at all. I think a cliffhanger is kind of a good way to end a series. I mean, my concern is more like, what was their plan for season 3? And if they do a season 3, could that possibly work? I think it works okay as like it's just a weird mind-melting ending to the show.
Right. I mean, it's all about the kind of cliffhanger and how it contextualizes things. Because at this point, it kind of leaves it feeling like an Outer Limits episode or Twilight Zone or something.
See, this is all why we can't have nice things, though. Like, every time we see a new, Disney remake come out, if we go in the comments section, which for some reason I do because I'm crazy, people are like, why do we have the same stories over and over again? Why don't we have new stories? This is what it looks like when you do new stories. You don't just fuck with what the story is. You fuck with the structure of storytelling itself and what people believe that they have been led to expect. And people get upset if you take that away. And it's like, you ask for new stuff. When we give you new stuff, you give up halfway through the season, you stop watching it, and you declare it unwatchable. And it's tragic to me.
No, I'm totally with you, Sarah. I would give a lot to know what their plan was for season 3, 4, and 5. And I would be happy to have it demonstrated that they had something that was going to work. I think it's an absolute tragedy that if we never find out the answer to that question.
I do hope that she writes books, because I honestly see that as the natural extension. Like, I think that, if we can't get another network to pick this up or whatever, the way that Amazon did it with The Expanse, I think they would make absolutely wonderful books. And if you've read anything that Britt Marling has posted about it on Instagram and Twitter and stuff, she's a wonderful writer, and she could do it. So I don't
she's
know
fantastic.
why,
I think a realistic outcome might be, with Sense8, they gave that little miniseries wrap-up, or just a 2-hour movie after it was canceled. Maybe they can at least give her 2 hours per season just to kind of wrap things up instead of 8 hours per season, which is probably more than necessary.
I think she would not know what to do with 2 hours. Like, she'd be like, 2 hours? I mean, just look at the style that she's, she likes to weave these long things. She's a novelist.
No, I agree with you. Like, it does feel like you're watching a novel, but if you had to, you could have truncated season 2 into 2.5 hours.
Does anyone give any credence to the idea that this is some crazy publicity stunt, meta narrative sort of thing, the cancellation of the show, and then everyone has to do the movements in real life on YouTube to save the to bring it back to life?
I think she
no.
I think she shot that down as of 2 hours ago. I read the most recent thing was her responding to the girl who was doing a hunger strike. There was a girl who had not eaten in several days, who was camped out outside of the Netflix headquarters, and the showrunners actually met her with food and water and were like, hey, please eat. But I do think that, the titles of the article were basically no, guys, it really is dead. This is not some meta joke that's part of the story, unfortunately. This is not. So if she hadn't come on and clarified, then maybe, given the strangeness of the show, I might have considered it. It might be a possibility.
I can't imagine them doing that just because of what future behavior from fans that would invite,
right. Yeah.
But if they did it, holy fuck, talk about a mind fuck of all mind fucks. Holy shit.
Well, speaking of Game of Thrones a minute ago, it feels like this was probably a direct casualty of that Benioff and Weiss deal. I mean, they got, $100 million development deal? So a lot of Netflix shows got the axe all of a sudden.
Well, I think there's some broader context there.
Who would give them money after what they did?
Netflix has been, signing a lot of really big checks to big name showrunners. They had the $300 million deal for Ryan Murphy, $100 million for Shonda Rhimes. This is the Benioff and Weiss deal was sort of the latest in a number of deals, and it seems like that is the direction that they're going in. And then they signed that deal. They also had a really bad quarterly earnings report, and subscriber growth is not going the way they want it to. And so then they had a number of, as Rafael was alluding to, they had a number of cancellations at around the same time. So I do think that it's a victim of the broader business, fortunes of Netflix. I don't know that pegging it specifically to Benioff and Weiss is entirely fair.
I am happy to string them up by their entrails. I'm very, it's so frustrating because it's so obvious that what happened with D&D is they as soon as they lost the source material because they ran out of.
Okay, wait. I feel like this is going off topic.
Well, no, I promise I'm not going to get into any spoilers. I'm just saying that they aren't showrunners themselves. They're not content creators. They are producers. And when they ran out of the source material, they didn't know their ass from their elbow. This woman is a original content creator. She is coming up with the content herself. She is acting in it. She's doing all this work with her partner, and it's just so frustrating to see the same hacks rewarded over and over again because they brought in, they rode the coattails on George R.R. Martin's material, but they as soon as they ran out of that, they didn't know what they were doing.
I definitely lament the loss of a Britt Marling show, but I do not agree at all with that Benioff and Weiss assessment, but I'll just leave it at that.
Well, let me ask you, Sarah. I mean, one other thing that I sort of thought about the finale of season 2 and sort of what it seemed to suggest about the direction for season 3 was that once again, Prairie is going to be sort of a prisoner of Hap and sort of abused by him and under his power. And I wasn't sure that I wanted to see another season of this woman being kind of under the power of this man and being gaslit by him and stuff like that. I was just curious what your take on that would be as a, coming from a feminist perspective.
Well, but she isn't. She defeats him in multiple ways throughout each of these shows, each of these seasons. In the first one, she defeats him in her own way, where he kind of lets her go because of the dynamic between them, because of all of the things that have happened, and recognizes that by letting her go, he's already taken from her what he wanted. He has already broken her, right? And then in the second season, she has that wonderful speech with him where she kind of says, that she, I can't remember the words exactly, but she basically talks about, how she rises up every time he hurts her and becomes more powerful. And so from a feminist perspective, it is a very fascinating take on trauma and on the relationship you have with abusers and stuff like that, and on indeed the patriarchy. And to me, the whole reason why this show was canceled is because we are seeing the same tropes over and over again played out, where people respond to masculine storytelling. They respond to the same stories over and over again. That's where they're willing to put their money in. And at the same time, they're over here saying, well, where are all the new stories? When we give them to you, this is what happens.
Do you think that could continue for 5 seasons, or do you think she has to more decisively defeat him before we get to the end of the 5 episodes?
I think if what you're asking is do I expect to see another season where she's being traumatized and another season where she's being traumatized, and then she finishes him off at the 11th hour. And I don't think that's what's going to happen. I think if you are watching the show carefully, you notice that she is always the victor in her own way. And, she just, it's a very different way of taking on this idea of dominance. She's not winning in a very traditional sense. She's not murdering him at the end and everybody stands around cheering. That's not the story that's being told here. It's a much more intimate, much more internal way of talking about, gaining power in spite of all of this trauma.
Mm-hmm. Do you, so Anthony, you were talking a lot about the sort of financials of Netflix and stuff. Does anyone have any idea what the prospects are for Netflix changing their minds, or the show getting picked up by some other streaming service or something? Is there any buzz about any of that?
I haven't heard anything about that.
Do you think like Amazon might pick it up or anything like that?
It seems possible. I mean, that's one of the interesting things to me, as somebody who writes about the business, is the fact that I think part of how Netflix built their reputation at the beginning was as somebody who revived these beloved properties like Arrested Development. And so there was this idea of, like this thing that was killed before its time, maybe Netflix will be the saviors and the ones to resurrect it. And then, this year they've sort of found themselves on the other side of that equation, where they've been canceling a lot of shows, and then they canceled one day at a time, which is being revived on another network. So it seems like, I don't know the details of the ownership structure around the OA in particular, but it seems like that's something that hasn't happened at least one other time.
I'm not sure of this, but I think I saw somebody post something sort of demanding that Netflix release the rights to the OA back to Britt Marling so she could continue the story or shop it around, which made me think that she doesn't have the same sort of deal that like The Expanse had, for example, with Sci-Fi. I don't know. Does anyone know anything about that?
That would be a dick move. If that's why she can't take it and do other things with it, that would suck.
Yeah, my sense in most of these cases is that usually, the production company has like the ultimate rights, but that, usually you can sort of shop it around, and then they probably have to pay. If you wanted to make a third season, you'd probably have to pay Netflix a certain amount of money in order to make that third season, but that it wouldn't be, impossible. But that's just speculation on my part.
We really just have to get Jeff Bezos to become a fan of the OA, because the whole reason why The Expanse was renewed is because Jeff Bezos was personally a fan, and he just obviously wanted to continue, seeing it.
It seems like more than once a long layoff between seasons has kind of taken away buzz from a show. It kind of happened with Westworld and the OA. Seasons 1 on both shows were very popular and talked about, but then no one was really talking about season 2 of the OA that I really noticed. It kind of just was flying under the radar this time.
And it was a 2.5 year gap between.
And she explained why that that's part of their process, is that they are writing it and acting in it. So they can't like just spend the season writing it while the actors are, working on the previous season. Like they have a completely different process because she's doing so much.
I think it's just an unfortunate reality that people will wait 2 to 3 years for a movie installment, but they lose their train of thought and momentum with the TV show. It's just not the same.
Right? And we're talking about 8 hours of content versus 2 hours of content. So to me, it should be the norm that we're taking a long time between seasons if you want the season to be any good.
Right. I agree.
Like I said, I didn't know anything about the OA, like what it was about or anything. And I follow, obviously, this stuff, reasonably closely. And I mean, I've seen so much passion for this show on Twitter, after the cancellation was announced. But it does seem that, it has a very, very passionate fan base, but maybe a small fan base.
It's kind of the sad reality that sometimes you don't realize a show is popular until it gets canceled. I mean, like Farscape, all of a sudden the fans launched a whole campaign, but sometimes it's too late.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I've seen a lot of people sort of blaming Netflix's algorithmic, approach for this, that they sort of like, they fund tons and tons of stuff, like so much stuff. It's just like going on Netflix is like this giant, it's like this jungle of like content, like you don't even know what's what. And then they just rely on the algorithm to, prune that down, and that doesn't, would tend not to reward offbeat, smart, polarizing shows that might, have more artistic merit.
Yeah. And Netflix's algorithms, they've always put way too much stock in those. Like I personally, everything I've ever watched on Netflix, I've usually watched because I don't want to pay for it on iTunes to download it from the Apple Store through my Apple TV because I'm only casually interested in it. Or, and I'm not talking about the original series, obviously, but in terms of movies and stuff or other TV shows that were not original series by Netflix. But so all of their, just in terms of me as a user, what their algorithm knows about me is these are the things that I've watched. But what they don't know is these are literally the things that I wasn't interested in enough to watch in the theater or to watch, to rent, paying for it through other traditional means. So therefore, from the beginning, your algorithm is working on faulty information. So I generally don't get a lot out of the things that it suggests that I watch.
So I have seen some protests planned. I saw this thing where it's like they have a particular date. I think maybe it was October 18th. I'd have to check that. But, they're trying to get people to threaten to cancel their Netflix subscriptions if the OA isn't renewed by that date.
I'll do it. I can live without Netflix for a couple days.
Yeah, I would cancel it and then sign back up when the next Stranger Things came out or something.
Yeah, so I don't think that's likely to
be
to
successful.
work. But I don't know, Sarah. Are you going to be protesting in any way?
I've been, racking my brains trying to think of some creative solution because I don't think that protests in this, of entertainment are particularly successful for the reasons we just outlined, right? Like, I would love to give up my Netflix, but unfortunately there are other things that Netflix does that I would still like to watch, and so I, can't. I would only be doing it as a show of, for a month or two. So it's really frustrating because it's very hard to as a small little audience member to know what to do about stuff like this. And I really have a lot of respect for the fans who are out there, creating new hashtags and creating new Twitter accounts solely devoted to saving the OA and doing all of these crazy things and learning the movements. I am way too introverted to do that sort of thing. So it's wonderful to watch them do it. And I've actually followed a couple of people and they've followed me back just because you end up, sort of uniting together because you're all trying to save this precious thing.
Yeah, you changed your Twitter handle to...
I sure did.
Yeah.
That's the perfect response of an introvert.
All right, cool. So we're pretty much out of time, so we should start wrapping this up. So how about Anthony? Do you have any final thoughts at the end here about the future of the OA or how it felt to watch it or talk about it or anything?
No, I mean, I would say that, again, in general, I felt like the show got a lot better. I liked the first season, and I thought the second season was even better. And it was interesting the way that Sarah was talking about it as this sort of like meticulously planned show. And I don't know a lot about what happened behind the scenes, so certainly that sounds like that's the case. But in fact, what I responded to about it was not the feeling that all the pieces were fitting together, but just the sort of moment to moment inventiveness and just sort of the fact that like in any given episode, it felt like anything could happen. And so for that reason, I'm certainly sad to see it go. But I'm glad we got the 2 seasons that we did.
Yeah. I watched an interview with Britt Marling on YouTube, and one of the comments I read, it said, that she's such a presence that even this sort of fairly typical promotional interview for her TV show seems like religious somehow, because, she's so like, I don't know, she conveys this sense of just thoughtfulness and deepness and sort of otherworldliness almost. And so the show really is, I don't think it could be the show it is without her. And she's just so perfect. It was written for her, by her. And again, it's just sort of a shame that sort of singular, character, can't make it past 2 seasons. But I'm sure she'll do amazing things in the future anyway. Rafael, final thought.
Yeah, I think Britt Marling's one of the most talented people in Hollywood, and I think if that's the end of the show, it was still 2 superlative seasons, and we were lucky to have it. It just had great big ideas like that mycelial network and talking octopuses, psychic octopuses. So, it's a shame, but I loved it. So it was a good run.
Yeah. Sarah, final thought?
I wish that I had thought to save this beforehand, but the words that Britt Marling wrote about the end of the show and the way that she described the end, I wish I had thought about opening this up on my computer but they're worth reading because she really talks about what it is to, tell a story together with a group of people rather than there being an individual hero, and why that attracted her to speculative fiction in the first place, why that attracted her to science fiction, just about being a woman and constantly being sort of stuck in these very specific ways that stories are told and wanting to break free of that. And to me, that's what makes me trust her as a content creator. Like, you can see the work is there in terms of this desire to communicate. And it's not that she's this, she's a lot of content creators, a lot of showrunners are out there going, okay, well, what's the next big story? Or, they sort of latch onto other people's stories and say, how do we tell this? And you just really feel that sense of authenticness from her, that she is very desperately trying to rearrange the way that we tell stories entirely. And I just have so much respect for her, and she's worth following on Twitter and Instagram and stuff to read what she has said about the ending of this show.
Yeah, and that point about the importance of community, she makes that same point in this Georgetown convocation speech I watched, which is amazing. Everyone should definitely watch that. And she talks a little bit about, kind of how she got started in film and her work with her collaborators and things. And just after she finishes, it just shows a shot of the audience and people are just turning into each other and saying like, wow, like mouthing wow. And she gets a standing ovation. So definitely check that out. And yeah, I am not giving up hope that we will see more OA. If you're listening to this and you haven't watched it, definitely give it a try. As we said, it's not for everybody, but the people that it connects with, you can see on Twitter, it really, really connects with them. And so it's worth definitely giving it a shot. And yeah, and if you love the show and you want it to continue, I would keep an eye out for campaigns or, whatever you might be able to do to spread the word about it. I think we haven't necessarily seen the end of this show.
Yeah.
So I think we're going to wrap things up there. So we've been speaking with Anthony Ha, Sara Lynn Michener, and Rafael Jordan. So thanks everyone so much for joining us.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks again.
And that was our panel. So big thanks again to Anthony Ha, Sara Lynn Michener, and Rafael Jordan for joining us on the show. Big thanks as well to Clement Coleman, Garrett Lester, and Anders Kilstedt, who all just signed up this week to support us on Patreon. Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please sign up to give us $1 or $2 per episode over at patreon.com/geeks. And if you'd rather make a one-time contribution, you can do that via check or PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. So big thanks again to everyone who's contributed. We really appreciate it. All right, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your host, visit davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by yours truly, Jack Kincaid. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.